My name is Kayla Martinez. I'm 34 years old, and the day my husband called me useless in front of a courtroom full of strangers was the day I realized something crucial.
Silence can be the loudest weapon you'll ever wield. Everyone in that room waited for me to break down, to scream, to defend myself like he expected me to. But I didn't. I stayed silent, and that silence changed absolutely everything. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. If you've ever been publicly humiliated by someone you trusted, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. You're going to want to see how this unfolds, because what happened next shocked everyone, including him. The fluorescent lights hummed above us as his voice bounced off the sterile courtroom walls, each word designed to cut me down piece by piece. My hands were folded neatly on the table in front of me, fingers interlaced so tightly my knuckles turned white. I could feel the eyes of the judge, the lawyers, random people sitting in the gallery, all of them watching, waiting to see if I would crumble under the weight of his cruelty. My heart pounded so hard, I thought everyone could hear it, but my face remained calm, almost unnaturally so. He kept going, his confidence growing with every insult, thinking my silence meant defeat. What he didn't know was that every word he spoke was digging his own grave deeper. I had learned something powerful in the months leading up to this moment. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is let someone talk long enough to expose who they really are. And trust me, he was about to show everyone in that room exactly the kind of man he'd always been behind closed doors. This wasn't just any ordinary day. This was the day my marriage officially died. Not with tears or dramatic screaming matches, but with cold, calculated words meant to erase my existence entirely. We were in the middle of divorce proceedings, and he had decided that the courtroom would be his stage, the place where he'd publicly paint me as nothing more than a burden he'd carried for years. His lawyer sat beside him, nodding along like a puppet, while mine squeezed my arm gently under the table, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone, even though I felt completely isolated in that moment. He spoke loudly, confidently, like I wasn't even sitting 10 feet away from him. Your Honor, my wife contributed nothing to our marriage. While I worked 60-hour weeks building my career, she stayed home doing, well, frankly, I'm not sure what she did all day. His words hung in the air like poison, and I watched a few people in the gallery shift uncomfortably in their seats. Each insult he threw at me felt like a stamp being pressed onto my forehead, marking me as worthless in front of everyone who mattered. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the humiliation and the pain, something stayed remarkably calm. I walked into that courtroom underestimated, dismissed, erased before I even had a chance to speak. And that, as it turned out, was his biggest mistake. Because while he'd spent our entire marriage convincing me I was nothing, I'd spent the last 8 months quietly proving him wrong. Little did he know, the woman sitting across from him wasn't the same person he'd married. She had learned to fight without making a sound. What happened next? Well, let's just say revenge doesn't always come with a raised voice. He didn't just insult me. He performed for the room, his voice dripping with condescension as he listed every way I had supposedly failed him as a wife. She couldn't even manage our household properly. Bills were paid late, meals were basic at best. And don't even get me started on how she let herself go physically. The way he said it, with that smug half-smile playing on his lips, made my stomach turn. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, the familiar burn of shame creeping up my neck, but I forced myself to breathe slowly through my nose. Before I continue, make sure you're subscribed and leave a like if you think what he's doing is absolutely wrong, because what comes next is going to blow your mind. His lawyer occasionally interjected with leading questions that made things worse. And did your wife contribute financially to the household? They'd ask, already knowing the answer. Not a single dollar in 7 years, he'd respond, shaking his head like I was some kind of parasite he'd graciously hosted. Each exchange felt like another stamp on my forehead, useless, lazy, worthless. I watched the court reporter's fingers fly across her machine, permanently recording his version of our marriage, and part of me wanted to jump up and scream that he was lying, but I didn't. I sat there, hands still folded, face carefully neutral. What he didn't see was the slight narrowing of the judge's eyes during his third or fourth rant. What he didn't notice was how his own lawyer shifted uncomfortably when he called me essentially a pet that needed feeding. The room's energy was changing, slowly but surely, and I could feel it even if he couldn't. His confidence was morphing into something uglier, arrogance mixed with cruelty, and people were starting to see it. But that revelation was still coming. For now, I let him talk, because sometimes you have to let someone hang themselves with their own rope. Every fiber of my being wanted to stand up and defend myself right then and there. My lawyer had even leaned over twice, whispering, "We can object to this," but I shook my head both times. I realized something crucial in that moment. If I interrupted him with anger, with defensive explanations, with tears, I would only be feeding into the narrative he'd already built. He expected me to be emotional, irrational, exactly the kind of unstable woman he'd been describing. My silence, my composure, that was throwing him off his script, even if he didn't fully realize it yet. I thought about all those nights at home when I'd tried to explain myself, tried to make him see my perspective, only to be talked over or dismissed entirely. "You're being too sensitive," he'd say, or "You're twisting my words again." I'd learned the hard way that arguing with him was like trying to nail jello to a wall, pointless and exhausting. So I'd stopped trying months ago, and that decision had given me something unexpected: clarity. When you stop defending yourself constantly, you start seeing patterns instead of just feeling pain. His insults in that courtroom weren't new. They were just louder, more public versions of what he'd been saying privately for years. Silence gave him enough space to expose himself completely, to show everyone exactly who he was without any filter or pretense. Sometimes you don't need to fight back in the moment. You just need to let people talk long enough to reveal their true character. My mother used to say, "Give someone enough rope and they'll hang themselves," and I'd never understood that phrase until now. So I sat there, absorbing his words like they were just sounds instead of weapons, knowing that my turn would come. And when it did, I wouldn't need to yell or cry or beg anyone to believe me. The truth would speak for itself. The courtroom humiliation wasn't something new. It was just the public finale to years of private erosion. I remember the first time he dismissed my work, about 3 years into our marriage. I'd spent weeks planning a fundraiser for the local women's shelter, coordinating volunteers, securing donations, designing promotional materials. When I excitedly told him we'd raised over $15,000, he barely looked up from his laptop. "That's nice, babe. Real jobs have actual paychecks, though," he'd said, like my effort was some kind of cute hobby a child would pursue. The words stung, but I told myself he was just stressed from work. But it didn't stop there. Every sacrifice I made was systematically reframed as nothing. When I postponed my master's degree so he could accept a promotion that required relocation, he never acknowledged it. Instead, he'd joke at dinner parties about how I never finished anything I started. When I spent my afternoons caring for his elderly mother after her hip surgery, cooking her meals and driving her to physical therapy appointments for 3 months straight, he complained that the house wasn't as clean as usual. My contributions were invisible to him unless they directly served his needs, and even then, they were never quite good enough. I learned to doubt myself before he ever did the work for me. I'd catch myself apologizing for things that weren't my fault. Sorry the dinner wasn't fancier. Sorry I didn't look as put together as his colleague's wife. Sorry I existed in a way that somehow always fell short. My confidence, which had once been strong enough to carry me through college on a full scholarship and land me a promising job at a marketing firm, had been slowly chipped away like paint peeling off old wood. By the time we sat in that courtroom, I'd almost started to believe his version of me. Almost, but not quite. Sitting in that courtroom felt like being on display in a museum. Exposed, frozen, analyzed by strangers who knew nothing about the real story. The judge, a stern-looking woman in her 60s with silver-framed glasses, would occasionally glance my way with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was it pity? Judgment? Curiosity? The lawyers shuffled their papers and exchanged whispered comments, creating a soundtrack of rustling and murmuring that made the room feel both crowded and isolating at the same time. Even the random people in the gallery, probably law students or retirees with nothing better to do, leaned forward in their seats like they were watching some dramatic courtroom TV show. If you've ever felt completely exposed and judged by people who don't know your story, hit that like button and stay subscribed because I'm about to show you how I turned this around. I could feel their judgment before anyone even spoke it aloud. When he said I let myself go, I saw a woman in the third row unconsciously smooth her own hair, and I knew she was measuring me against some invisible standard. When he claimed I contributed nothing, I watched the bailiff's expression shift slightly, like he was recalculating his impression of me in real time. It's strange how other people's perceptions can feel like physical weight pressing down on your shoulders, making it harder to breathe, harder to sit up straight. I wanted to scream at all of them, "You don't know me. You don't know what I've survived." But instead, I reminded myself of something my therapist had told me during one of our sessions 2 months earlier. This moment will pass, Kayla. Feelings are temporary. Even the unbearable ones, you just have to breathe through them. So that's what I did. I focused on my breathing. In through my nose for 4 counts, hold for 4, out through my mouth for 4. My hands remained folded on the table, steady despite the trembling I felt inside. The room kept watching, kept waiting for me to break, but I refused to give them that show, because I knew something they didn't. This story wasn't over, and the ending was going to surprise everyone. Especially him. Something strange happened while he continued his monologue of insults. His words stopped hurting and started informing me instead. It was like a switch flipped in my brain, transforming pain into data, emotion into observation. I began noticing patterns in how he spoke, the way he exaggerated small issues, the way he conveniently omitted entire years of our marriage, the way he painted himself as some kind of saint who'd tolerated an impossible burden. Each lie became a clue, each distortion a piece of evidence showing not my failure, but his need to rewrite history to protect his own ego. The shift felt almost physical, like a lens snapping into sharp focus after months of blurry vision. I stopped hearing "you're worthless" and started hearing, "I need you to be worthless in this story so I can be the hero." I stopped feeling shame about staying home and started remembering that it was his idea in the first place. He'd wanted a wife who could host his work dinners, manage his schedule, make his life comfortable while he climbed the corporate ladder. When he claimed I did nothing all day, I mentally listed everything I actually did, managed our finances down to the last receipt, coordinated his mother's medical care, maintained our home, organized his business trips, even proofread his important emails because his writing skills were mediocre at best. Pain, I realized, could be transformed into something sharper and more useful: focus. All those years of absorbing his criticism had taught me to see myself through his distorted mirror, but now I was finally stepping away from that reflection and seeing the truth. I wasn't useless. I wasn't lazy. I was simply married to someone who needed me to be small so he could feel big. And that realization, sitting in that uncomfortable courtroom chair with dozens of eyes on me, was oddly liberating. The anger was still there, hot and real beneath my calm exterior, but it was no longer chaotic. It was fuel. While he sat there confidently listing my supposed failures, he had absolutely no idea what I'd been doing for the past 8 months. After I'd filed for divorce, something in me woke up, not with a bang, but with quiet, determined resolve. I'd started taking online courses in digital marketing late at night after he'd gone to bed. Headphones on, laptop screen dimmed so he wouldn't notice the light under the bedroom door. I remembered skills I'd buried years ago, dusted them off, and built on them with a hunger I hadn't felt since my early 20s. My life had been growing off stage while he assumed I was just sitting around feeling sorry for myself. I'd reconnected with former colleagues from my old marketing job, the one I'd left when he said we were ready to start a family that never came because he kept pushing the timeline back year after year. One of those colleagues, Sarah Chen, had started her own consulting firm and needed someone with my exact skill set. Within 3 months, I was freelancing for her, working on campaigns for small businesses, building a portfolio, earning my own money for the first time in 7 years. Not a fortune, but enough to open my own bank account, enough to prove I could stand on my own 2 feet. I'd also kept meticulous records of everything, and I mean everything, every time he'd asked me to handle something for his career, and then later claimed he did it himself. Every financial contribution I'd made before I stopped working, tracked down through old bank statements. Every text message where he'd praised my help privately but dismissed it publicly. Every email where he'd literally asked me to manage aspects of his life because he was too busy. I had documents, timelines, screenshots, and receipts organized in a cloud folder labeled Garden Project because he never paid attention to anything I did anyway. Facts don't shout. They just wait, patient and undeniable, for their moment. The decision to gather evidence wasn't born from revenge, at least not initially. It started about 6 months before I filed for divorce, on a random Tuesday afternoon when he came home and accused me of spending his money irresponsibly. I'd bought groceries, paid the electric bill, and purchased a birthday gift for his niece, nothing unusual. But he stood in our kitchen, waving the credit card statement like it was proof of some crime, telling me I needed to justify every purchase from now on. That's when I realized I needed to protect myself, because the narrative he was building didn't match reality. So I started documenting everything with the precision of a scientist conducting research. I went through 7 years of emails and found dozens where he'd explicitly asked me to handle his professional obligations. Can you call my client and reschedule? You're better at this stuff than I am. Please proofread this proposal. I need your eye for detail. Handle the contractor situation. I don't have time. I screenshot each one, noting the dates, saving them in organized folders. If you're going through something similar and you need to hear this, document everything, subscribe to this channel, and drop a like because the next part shows you exactly why preparation matters more than anger. I tracked financial contributions too, going all the way back to the beginning of our marriage. For the first 3 years, before he convinced me to quit my job, I'd contributed 40% of our household income. I found proof that I'd used my savings, $12,000 I'd built up before we even met, to help with the down payment on our house, something he'd completely erased from his memory. I gathered statements from his mother thanking me for the care I'd provided, messages from his colleagues' wives mentioning how I'd helped coordinate company events. None of this was about shaming him or winning some public battle. It was about grounding myself in truth when his version of reality had been trying to bury me for years. Facts are patient. They don't need drama. They just need their moment in the light. Patience isn't something I'd ever been particularly good at. I was the kid who opened Christmas presents early, the student who rushed through exams, the employee who wanted immediate results. But sitting in that courtroom, watching him perform his carefully rehearsed victim narrative, I understood for the first time that patience isn't weakness, it's control. It's the ability to hold your breath before a deep dive, to wait for exactly the right moment instead of wasting your energy on the wrong one. Every second I stayed quiet while he talked was a second he dug himself deeper into a hole he didn't even know he was creating. I'd learned this lesson the hard way over the past months. There were so many moments when I wanted to confront him, to throw evidence in his face, to make him admit what he'd done and who he really was. One night, about 4 months before the divorce proceedings began, I'd actually drafted a long email listing every lie, every manipulation, every time he'd rewritten history to suit himself. My finger hovered over the send button for a full minute, my heart racing with the anticipation of finally being heard. But something stopped me. Maybe intuition, maybe exhaustion, maybe wisdom I didn't know I had. I deleted the draft and went to bed, and I'm so glad I did. Timing, I realized, matters infinitely more than volume. Screaming the truth when nobody's ready to hear it is just noise, but presenting facts calmly when the moment is right, that's impact. So I waded through his insults in the courtroom, through his lawyer's leading questions, through the uncomfortable shifting of people in the gallery. I waited through my own lawyer's concerned glances and the judge's occasional raised eyebrow at his more outrageous claims. I waited like someone holding a winning hand in poker, knowing that revealing it too early would ruin everything, and with every passing minute, I could feel the room's energy shifting, could sense that his confidence was starting to look less like strength and more like something else entirely. But let me be completely honest with you. Staying quiet during all of that hurt more than speaking ever could have. It felt like swallowing broken glass while maintaining a straight face, like holding your breath underwater until your lungs scream for air. Every insult he threw at me landed somewhere deep inside, even though I tried to tell myself they were just words. just lies, just his twisted version of reality. The little girl inside me who'd always sought approval, who'd always tried so hard to be good enough, was crying in some locked room of my heart while I forced my face to remain neutral. There were physical effects too, things nobody could see from the outside. My jaw ached from clenching my teeth so hard, and I'd probably ground down a year's worth of enamel in that single hour. My shoulders were so tense they felt like stone, and I knew I'd have a headache later that would last for days. Under the table, my hands had gone from white-knuckled grip to slightly numb, and I had to consciously remind myself to breathe normally instead of taking shallow, panicked breaths. The cost of composure was being paid by my body in ways that wouldn't show up until later, when I was alone and safe and could finally fall apart. But I trusted the process I'd built, the plan I'd carefully constructed over months of preparation. My therapist, Dr. Patricia Morrison, had warned me this would be the hardest part, not the divorce itself, but sitting through his attempts to destroy me publicly while I remained silent. "You'll want to defend yourself," she'd said during our last session. "Every instinct will tell you to fight back in the moment, but remember what we talked about. Strategic silence is not the same as submission. It's choosing your battlefield." So I held on to those words like a lifeline, repeating them silently while he continued his performance. This pain was temporary. The truth was permanent. I just had to hold on a little longer. The shift in the room was subtle at first, so slight I almost missed it. But around the time he launched into his fourth or fifth continuous rant about my supposed inadequacies, I noticed the judge lean back in her chair slightly, arms crossing over her chest, a posture I recognized as skepticism. One of the law students in the gallery actually rolled her eyes when he claimed I'd manipulated him into marriage, and the court reporter looked up from her machine with an expression that clearly said, "Really?" His confidence, which had seemed unshakable at the beginning, was starting to curdle into something uglier and less convincing. People were no longer nodding along sympathetically. They were watching him with the kind of attention you give to someone who's revealing more about themselves than they realize. His voice had gotten louder, more insistent, almost desperate to be believed. "I'm telling you, Your Honor, living with her was like carrying dead weight up a mountain every single day." The metaphor was so overdramatic, so clearly rehearsed and yet so poorly delivered that I saw his own lawyer wince slightly. When you talk too much, when you pile on too many accusations, when you push too hard, people start to wonder why you're trying so desperately to convince them. Arrogance had fully replaced confidence now, and it was painting him in colors he didn't intend. He interrupted his own lawyer twice to add important details that were really just more insults dressed up as facts. He spoke over the judge once, just for a second, but enough that she had to firmly say, "Mr. Martinez, I'm speaking." The room's temperature had changed completely from when we'd started. My silence, my stillness, my refusal to engage with his theatrics was creating a contrast so stark that people couldn't help but notice. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is absolutely nothing at all. Just wait, just breathe, just let the truth reveal itself through someone else's lies. Sitting there listening to him describe a person I didn't recognize made me think about who I actually was before all of this, before the marriage, before I'd learned to make myself smaller to fit into his world. I remembered the 24-year-old version of myself who'd graduated summa cum laude with a degree in communications, who'd landed a competitive position at Fletcher & Associates Marketing within 2 weeks of graduation, who'd negotiated her own salary without flinching. That woman had opinions, ambitions, a laugh that was too loud for fancy restaurants, and a stubborn streak that drove her mother crazy. Where had she gone? When exactly had I traded confidence for compliance, stopped asking for what I deserved, and started apologizing for wanting anything at all? I thought about the early days of our relationship, how charming he'd seemed when he'd offered to take care of everything so I could relax and not stress so much. At the time, it felt like love, like someone finally seeing how hard I worked and wanting to give me a break. But looking back now, I could see how methodically he'd dismantled my independence, brick by brick, decision by decision, until I'd forgotten I'd ever built anything on my own. But here's the thing about your core identity. It doesn't actually disappear, no matter how deeply it gets buried. That woman, The one who'd walked into job interviews with her head high and her portfolio polished, who'd traveled solo through Europe one summer just to prove she could, who'd once told off a handsy customer at her college waitressing job without hesitation. She'd never left. She'd just been waiting, patient and quiet, for the moment I'd need her again. And sitting in that courtroom, absorbing insults that couldn't touch who I really was, I felt her rising back to the surface, like someone finally coming up for air after being underwater too long. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 45 minutes, the judge turned to me with an expression I still can't fully describe, something between curiosity and carefully controlled irritation at what she'd just witnessed. "Mrs. Martinez," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife, "you've been remarkably quiet during these proceedings. Would you like to respond to any of your husband's characterizations?" The room went completely silent, every eye shifting to me, waiting to see if I'd finally break, finally scream, finally give them the drama they'd been anticipating. I stood up slowly, smoothing down my navy blazer, the one I'd bought specifically for this day with my own money from my freelance work. My hands were steady now, the trembling from earlier completely gone. I looked at the judge, not at him, and I spoke once, clearly, with a voice that came from somewhere deep and unshakable. "Your Honor, I've prepared a detailed response to each of Mr. Martinez's claims, including financial records, correspondence, and third-party testimony that tell a very different story. My attorney has compiled everything into a formal document, but I'd like to address just one thing directly." I paused, finally turning to look at him for the first time since he'd started talking. "You said I contributed nothing to our marriage, but the truth is I contributed everything. My career, my time, my savings, my energy, my identity. The real question isn't what I gave, but why you needed to take it all and then pretend it never existed." My voice didn't shake. I didn't cry. I simply stated facts the way you'd read items off a grocery list. Calm, clear, undeniable. The judge nodded slowly, taking the folder my attorney handed her, and I watched his face drain of color as he realized, perhaps for the first time, that silence hadn't meant defeat. Truth landed heavier than all his noise ever could, settling into the room like gravity. I sat back down, and for the first time in 7 years, I felt completely, genuinely free. Not vindictive, not broken, just finally, beautifully free. After everything I just told you, I want to ask you something important. Have you ever been silenced by someone who claimed to love you? Have you ever sat there absorbing insults, swallowing your truth, wondering if maybe they were right about you all along? If any part of my story resonated with you, if you've ever felt erased or minimized or gaslit into doubting your own worth, I want you to know this. Your silence doesn't mean weakness, and their words don't define your reality. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is wait for the right moment to speak, and when you do, make it count. The next video I'm sharing is about something even more intense. It's about the quiet ways people take revenge, not through drama, but through healing and reclaiming their lives piece by piece. It's about what happened after I walked out of that courtroom and started rebuilding from scratch. And trust me, you're going to want to see how this journey continues. Some of you asked about the legal outcome, some wondered if he ever apologized, and others want to know how I found the strength to start over. I'll answer all of that and more. So here's what I need from you. Hit that subscribe button right now if you haven't already, because stories like this need to be heard and shared. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. And most importantly, remember this: speaking your truth doesn't always require volume. Sometimes it just requires patience, preparation, and the courage to stay silent until the moment you can speak with undeniable power. I'll see you in the next video, and thank you for being here with me through all of this. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one,